My Liberia experience in perspective. The following is an excerpt from the book by Ronald Quist, Such Were the Conditions, the Canplay Incident. Liberia, like much of Africa, is endowed with an abundance of natural resource wealth. There is hydroelectric potential, iron ore, timber, gold, and diamonds. There is also some indication that it has gas reserves offshore. Yet the Liberian people are unable to compete economically in the modern world and are left some of the poorest in the world. This is a typical story across Africa, yet there is nothing deficient or lacking about Liberia's individuals. Our tendency to ascribe our better living circumstances to our presumed superiority, when compared with the lives of people trapped in poverty, is a fallacy that ought to be put to rest once and for all. All one need do is look at the abject poverty many people in Nigeria live in. Yet Nigerians, people with the same ethnicity, culture and drive, constitute the most educated group in the United States and have great success. To be competitive in the modern world, a country needs a population that is well educated, one that has relevant technical and vocational skills and is in good health. It is a well-educated, healthy population that can build and sustain the institutions that underpin a well-functioning society and a productive economy. Furthermore, it needs the requisite infrastructure on a national scale: roads, railways, electricity, water, communications and housing. Presidents Barclay, Tubman and Talbot sought a symbiotic relationship with foreign investors. This is the naive logic of much of Africa's educated elite. Our intended narrative follows: we have below our feet great riches. We invite the foreign investor with their skill and capital to exploit these resources, and let us both share fairly in the riches. Our intention is to invest our earnings in development and to build our country's institutions to achieve a well-functioning society. One consequence would be the creation of a sizable market for the globe's goods and services, and in return we will provide goods and services in a fair trade that enriches and expands the quality of people's lives across the world. It is not the way things worked out in Liberia. The open door policy introduced more of a parasitic relationship than a symbiotic one in which the parasite stayed fed with fat and healthy profits, and the host remained poor except for a few agents and officials that were paid to protect the parasitical arrangement. Liberia has been a victim of a well-studied economic phenomenon that Richard Auty first labelled in 1993 as the resource curse. If we must accept it as the real-world consequence of the capitalistic pursuit of corporate profits, and also accept that any expectations of a more symbiotic relationship are naive and impractical, then it is just as important for international companies in the extractive industries to also recognize that the most successful parasites do not kill off their hosts. In the end, Liberia's iron ore mining enclaves did not suffer takeovers by the Liberian government nationalizing them. In retrospect, the motivation to renegotiate the iron ore concession arrangements were a fairer share of revenues, certainly nothing that would justify a coup. The company's assets were destroyed by marauding rebels and soldiers during Liberia's civil war. It was the underdeveloped people who could discern no benefit from the hundreds of millions of dollars that were mined each year out from under their feet who would put an end to the natural resource exploitation. In its final death throes, the host killed off the parasite. It may be too late to play the what-if game, but if these extractive industry investors had made fair tax and royalty payments consistent with the value of their iron ore exports and proportional to their contribution to the country's GDP, this would have led to a much more rapid education of the population and an improvement in their health. The mines would be made much more secure because the Liberian population would experience a discernible benefit from the ongoing success of their mining operations. The mining operations could still be producing steady profits for their owners many decades later. There may be a lesson to be learned in the observation that the Swiss-owned Club beer brewery, located in New KRU town Monrovia, remained unscathed throughout the country's civil war. All sides of the conflict could discern the benefits of a cold bottle of beer after a hard day of fighting. The parasitic character of the relationship between the mining operator and the people of Liberia was camouflaged by pointing to a generous corporate social responsibility program. The veil thrown up by the loud, often repeated shouts of corporate social responsibility was not broad enough to cover up the parasitic dimensions of the relationship. The discriminatory practices of paying Liberian engineers trained in some of the best universities in the United States and with considerable local knowledge to boot, just 1/3 the salary of a foreign engineer, only amplified the unfairness in the relationship. In the long run, a significant number of the countries that first responded to Liberia's open door policy are no longer operating there. Bong Mines has been taken over by the China Union Investment Company. Lamco has been taken over by ArcelorMittal, an Indian-owned company. Of course, such developments have far-reaching geopolitical consequences. As I look back at my years of working on and thinking about development in Liberia, I remain hopeful. This is true even if my 2 years of effort between 1979 and 1981 and a further 2 years between 1997 and 1999 have provided nothing tangible to show for the effort or financial investment. Liberia suffered a brutal civil war that severely impacted all parts of society across the length and breadth of the country. The country's infrastructure was destroyed. The LEC was left without generating capacity, very limited transmission and distribution capacity, and no metering. I can name 3 things that came out of that devastating and horrific experience that, in my view, bode well for the country. The first is the closer relationship, deeper understanding, and sense of a shared history between the Americo-Liberians and indigenous Liberians. The burden of suffering from the Civil War was placed equally on the shoulders of both segments of society. Their shared experience and suffering were a direct consequence of their being Liberian, and not because they belonged to one ethnic group or another. And it was specifically Liberians who suffered in the Civil War, not Ivorians, Guineans, or Sierra Leoneans. In 1976, it would have been impossible to imagine an indigenous Liberian president. Then the pendulum swung. In 1986, it would have been impossible to imagine an Americo-Liberian president. Since 1997, there have been both Americo-Liberian and indigenous Liberian presidents. I believe the likelihood of another Khan Play episode is considerably less today than it was in 1980. There is every indication that as Liberia journeys into its future, the distinction between both elements of society will become less and less significant. Greater societal cohesion, a common development vision, and a unity of purpose can only be beneficial to Liberia's development outlook. The second is the closer integration of Liberians within the broader West African region. The long and brutal war led to millions of Liberian refugees fleeing into Guinea, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. Stable Liberian communities emerged in each of these countries. Liberians now see themselves as very much a part of the West African community. They have exported their cuisine and culture to these countries, who in turn relate more closely to Liberia. This history has led to a significant increase in trade and business between Liberia and its West African neighbors. The third is Ian Yap's insightful, courageous, and decisive action under the most difficult of circumstances to prepare and convince President Charles Taylor to sign an executive order in 1999 to convert Liberia from an electrical power supply of 120 volts, 60 Hz, to 220 volts, 50 Hz. In doing so, he created the space for an economic power sector to emerge capable of supporting the country's accelerated development. Liberia, as regards the power sector, was essentially starting from scratch after the war. This single action would open the door for Liberia to access the West African power pool. This would be a two-way access, both to purchase power in the initial phase and then to later sell power as it developed its hydroelectric power potential.